Hey, great to have you here. So today we're going to be taking a look at Dexter Original Sin, Episode 5, and breaking that down. Before jumping into that, I did want to mention we got recent news on Dexter Resurrection. Apparently, James Remar has been confirmed to be back for that show, so it'll be interesting to see how he gets included. Obviously, in New Blood, we had Deb playing more of the ghost figure as opposed to Harry in the original series. Are we getting, presumably, Harry back in Resurrection? Who knows what they'll maybe do with Deb. Is Deb going to be in the show? Maybe they'll bounce back and forth between the two of them. Maybe they'll both be in the same scene together. But cool to see we're definitely getting James Remar back at least. So we're definitely getting Ghost Harry in Resurrection in some fashion. Now jumping into the non-spoiler section of Episode 5, starting off with the characters, I feel like the characters in this episode were really strong across the board. Really, we have our main trio of Morgan characters. We have Dexter, Harry, and Deb. All three of those were really strong. I feel like Dexter, Patrick Gibson's really coming to that role. He's doing a lot of mannerisms that really feel like Dexter. Just a lot of the movement and behavior feels very much fitting for that character. So great work there. Christian Slater as Harry in this episode I think was strong as well. I think he was a little bit better than he had been in prior episodes. And then Deb, I feel like that role and that character was more fitting than what we saw in episode 1. I mentioned in the last few reviews that it feels like the last few episodes, Deb has become a little bit more insufferable and not enjoyable to have as a character. I know she gets a little bit crazy here and there at times, but they haven't presented her in a way that's really endearing and a way that we want to see more of her on screen. This episode, I feel like, did a better job at reeling that back a little bit. She has kind of a fun scene with Dexter when they're at home. And there's more just development of the character and more understanding of their behaviors rather than just being a rebellious teen like we've seen in the last couple episodes. So I feel like a little bit stronger here. There's a scene where she's crying that's a little bit drawn out, but it feels like fitting because of the reason for it. So overall, it felt like characters, as far as the main three cast, was definitely strong. Dexter obviously carrying the load there, and the other two I felt like definitely performed better in this episode compared to previous ones. The rest of the cast, while they weren't shown a whole lot, I feel like they did a pretty good job. Honestly, the guy that Deb is seeing, Gio, he had more screen time than probably Masuka, Batista, LaGuerta all combined. But when they were in the episode, I feel like they did a fine job. I'm just kind of surprised we haven't had more of Batista and more of Masuka, but I get it's kind of an origin story. We're trying to get development of Harry and Deb and Dexter specifically. So having that many characters to share the screen time with is somewhat challenging. So makes sense maybe this specific episode and the last couple, they haven't been as prominent in those. As far as the high-level plot of the episode, it's obviously titled F is for F Up. This highlights that both Dexter and Harry mess up throughout the episode. We also have a return to the main plot points. So I mentioned in the prior review that some of the stuff that we'd been setting up in the early episodes kind of got abandoned in the prior episode. We return to that here. So we have the main plot of the criminal court case that takes place here. So cool to see that developing once again. We have a decent amount of suspense. Having the whole prequel thing, building suspense is a challenge, but I feel like involving Harry in the suspense works a little bit better because we're not as clear-cut as far as what happens to the future of Harry and how it all plays out. I know we've obviously been told at this point in time, a year from now is when Harry takes his own life, which was originally thought to be a heart attack, but obviously we found out the information of that from Matthews in the original show. Curious to see, I've seen some people say maybe they'll retcon that happening and we'll find out something else happens to Harry, but either way, a year from now is when ultimately Harry meets his demise. So there's still some challenges because we know Harry can't die at this point in time, but he can have a little more suspense than Dexter does because we don't know specifics of what happens to Harry throughout his career and things like that. I also felt the side plots that they did have here that was not part of the main story were less obnoxious or less time consuming, and I just feel like they better integrated overall to the main story, like having a scene where they have the cemetery or the brownies scene that has Dexter and Deb in it. So overall, it just felt like a well-paced episode. We stuck to the main storyline. When we veered off to other areas, it wasn't a long time spent there, and they eventually kind of tied into the main story, so didn't have as many side plots that weren't overly relevant in this episode. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to give this episode my first positive rating of the season. So enjoy this episode. It felt like, as mentioned, it was well-paced. Things progressed in a logical way. This episode spent a lot of time showing us plot points that we wanted to see, and less time on, frivolous stuff that's not really relevant to the overall big picture of things. Just kind of off the cuff, if I'm going from the first half of the season, I'm going to say, as far as an order goes, maybe something like 5, 4, 1, 3, 2 as far as my episode ranking. Something along those lines. Feels like the 5th episode thus far has been the strongest in my opinion. So jumping into the detailed breakdown, and this is going to have some spoilers obviously, but kind of running through the episode and what took place here. So we open it with the cliffhanger from the prior episode. So we had the guy Mad Dog that Dexter was chasing get hit with a car. So we start right away off with that in this episode, which was great to see, building tension right from the beginning. So it opens with the driver actually who hit the guy. He's crying about hitting Mad Dog, and Dexter's like backtracking to clean up the house. It's a cool situation here where we have Michael C. Hall talking about how long it takes to do certain things at the crime scene. So he's like, all right, it takes 5 minutes for them to do this, 3 minutes to do this. And he calculates, okay, it's going to be 15 minutes total for me to clean all this stuff up. And he's gathered some things from Miami Metro. He has like a black light and a spray bottle, so he's cleaning up the scene as best as possible. And sure enough, Miami Metro shows up like 12 minutes into it. He says something like, just my luck, Miami Metro was better than average that night. So they come in there and they're looking around the house a little bit, and they intended to build up suspense in this scene, but it felt pretty obvious to me. The cop goes, wait, what is that? And there's tons of guitars in this place, so you know that's what it's going to be. Sure enough, she points out, hey, it's a Van Halen Signature Series guitar. They ultimately leave. We have Dexter in the corner smiling to himself. Then he comes home to Harry having heard about Mad Dog, and Harry grills him quite a bit here. He's really yelling at Dexter for screwing up in the situation. He says, you're back to training exercises only. And Dexter makes the comment something like, hey, it wasn't the first time I've been grounded, just the first time as an adult. So he's in big trouble with Harry at this point. We then cut to Deb, and I was worried here about having more side plot development with Deb and Gio, but they don't spend a whole lot of time on it, thankfully. So we have her being dropped off at school by Gio, clearly pointing out he's aware of that she's going to school, and she kisses him in front of all the other girls there. So she's trying to kind of flaunt this guy. Thankfully, we don't spend a lot of time there. We then cut to Harry, who's at the morgue, who's trying to figure out what information they have on Mad Dog. Seems like Mad Dog did die from the accident. His body's in the body bag. And the guy that's in there says something like, I doubt this will end up in homicide unless the driver has some connection to Mad Dog. So kind of leaves a little bit of a cliffhanger there as well. We then cut back to Dexter, who's at home. He's kind of grounded at this point in time, and he's throwing a ball at the wall. He's just kind of messing around. Here, really, I feel like Patrick Gibson does a good job at doing a lot of mannerisms Dexter does. He's just walking and behaving a lot like Michael C. Hall would in the original series, so great to see that. He then goes to the fridge and eats an entire container of brownies, and we see on the side it was tagged as for Deb's volleyball teams. Secretly, we know here, hey, this was probably weed brownies, but Dexter's not aware of it. He's just chowing them down. I feel like they've turned Dexter into, like, I don't know, Brad Pitt from Ocean's 11. He's just eating in every scene. I don't know if he did that as much in the original show. He does it a little bit, but they're really leaning into Dexter always eating in this season, it feels like. We then cut back to Miami Metro. Harry's in the room with the captain and Tanya and other folks there. He's practicing for the court case against the guy in jail. So Levi Reed, the guy who was arrested in the first episode, has had somewhat of a background court proceeding, and Harry's kind of trying to prepare for being grilled because apparently the defense attorney is a very tough attorney, and he's to prepare for this because they want to avoid something bad happening. Levi Reed getting off, essentially. And this is kind of foreshadowing, it feels like, because he's practicing for this, so feels like we know something may be going wrong in the future. We then have a quick flashback to Harry and Laura, and they're just in the room together, and Harry is kind of standoffish because they ended last episode with them hooking up, and Harry is a little bit reluctant to have done that. He feels a little bit bad. He mentions this to her, and Laura's kind of bummed about the situation. Harry's going to leave, and sure enough, once again, he does not leave and instead hooks up with her, so continuing that side plot as well. We then cut back to present time with Dexter, and this is probably the scene that provides the most comedy throughout the episode. So we have Dexter super stoned, just watching TV. Deb comes home. He keeps saying Deborah, super weird, so kind of funny there. She quickly gets mad at him for the brownies, but kind of gets over it rather quickly. She's going to wind up leaving. Dexter's like, I don't like being out of control. Convinces her to stay there. She's like, yeah, I'll bond with my brother. So she eats some brownies as well. So they're kind of in the same headspace, and Dexter makes points like, oh, pizza's a circle, and the slices are triangles, and a box is a square. So saying a bunch of stuff you'd expect somebody high to say, have this like mind-boggling revelation. They have a little bit of bonding time. Deb mentions, hey, maybe we'll go on a double date at some point. She also calls her dad Harry at one point. I don't know if that's normal. It seemed more often than not she would just call him dad, but does that in the scene as well. She gets pretty emotional talking about her mom. Apparently the following day is 1 year since her death, so that gets brought up here, and they kind of talk about that a little bit. Dexter mentions he's not sure that their mom would be proud of them, and we get a little bit of like high Dexter revealing a little bit more than maybe he would normally do, where he says something like, hypothetically, what if I killed somebody? And Deb's like, ha 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 type thing. So he kind of slips up a little bit when he's in that head state, but not enough to make it really wind up mattering. Just kind of a little tease there overall. So the next day they wake up and they all kind of agree, hey, let's go to the gravesite at 5 p.m. And Dexter's ultimately back at work. While at work that day, Harry has Dexter fingerprint the driver who hit Mad Dog, trying to kind of test him, saying, oh, he didn't see you, Dexter, so go fingerprint him. You're probably good to go, right? So he goes in there, and the driver is showing a lot of remorse. He feels super guilty for the situation. Obviously, it was an accident, but he feels super bad about it. And LaGuerta, while in there, says something to him like, bad things happen, but they don't have to define you. You can grow from this. And Dexter kind of internalizes that for himself, saying, hey, you messed up with this kill. Let's try to improve going forward. And at this point, it seems like the Mad Dog case and that whole situation is pretty closed out for the season. We then have Dexter, who sees Tanya watching horse racing. He's asking her about like sedating the horses and getting that information. Obviously, we know where that's going to go with his eventual plans. And Tanya rushes off. She's like, oh, I'll be gone for a few hours. But it's already after 2, so I'm like, is she coming back at 5? I don't know. Feels like some of the time in this show feels a little over the place, but she goes off somewhere. I don't know if that's supposed to be a little bit alluding to some secret stuff with Tanya. She said something with her kids' sports, but I don't know. Maybe she has some secret stuff she's doing as well, so we'll have to see with that. We then cut to the court scene with Harry and Levi, the guy who's the criminal in this instance, and the defense attorney is really grilling Harry. He's answering the questions pretty well thus far, but then the defense attorney brings in this woman that Harry had previously interviewed, but really omitted the evidence with her because she was saying, oh, I was with Levi, and giving an alibi for him, but at the same time, she didn't know what day it was. He was like, what day is it? And she's like, oh, Tuesday. He's like, it's Thursday. So it felt like a lot of her facts weren't really reliable anyways, so he kind of brushed it off, but the defense attorney pitched it as, hey, you dismissed this piece of evidence, you didn't include it, you didn't disclose this, and somehow from that, the judge lets the criminal go since her alibi was being with Levi. Feels like a bit of a stretch, but I get things do happen and people do slip through the justice system, and this is pitched as being one of those instances, and we have the captain tell Harry, hey, take the afternoon off, and feels a little unsure here. He's like, is this the afternoon? Are you going to be fired? I don't know what's going to happen with the situation, but either way, bad news for Harry for slipping up in that procedure of the case. We also have Levi leaving the court, and he just looks back and he's like laughing at Harry, which very much feels like we know the direction we're going to go here with Harry wanting to sick Dexter on Levi. Meanwhile, Dexter somehow got in this horse barn. He just walks right in, and he lets a horse loose to distract the medical team there, goes in there, and sure enough, he finds M99. And this was kind of funny for me because for folks who are familiar with kind of the whole story of Dexter, this was a big staple with New Blood and the criticism people had. The entire show of the original Dexter series, Dexter used M99 to knock people out. That was the drug he used. It was always that, no questions. And then in New Blood, somehow he starts using ketamine, and they kind of retcon the original series saying he always used ketamine with every time he knocked somebody out. And that was a big gripe I had. It was a big gripe a lot of people had. There was speculation that Michael C. Hall has a song called Ketamine with his band, so maybe that's why they did it. But either way, they wound up retconning M99 in New Blood, and sure enough, we're back in Original Sin, and it's M99 again. So sometimes the little details in the show, they really botch, and I don't know, it doesn't wind up mattering that much, I guess, but for a dedicated fan base, you feel like you notice those things, and it's like, how did you not notice those things as the creators, as the writers? Maybe you did, and you didn't think it mattered. But either way, won't go down the long tangent of New Blood criticism there, but he finds M99, the original drug that it should have been, and he says something like, oh, pot didn't do it for me, this is my drug of choice, kind of joking about, hey, he really likes to kill people instead of doing drugs. He winds up leaving the office through the back door, and he goes into a stall with a horse, and the horse is approaching him, and he's not sure what to do, and he does the hair roll over the ear move to the horse, which him and Deb talked about earlier when they were high, and somehow it works and the horse calms down, but Dexter is probably going to be stuck there for a while because he has to go back out through the office that he came in. We then cut to Geo dropping off Deb at the cemetery. It seems like she was waiting for Dexter and Harry to show up for all three of them to go together, but they seem to not be reliable, so she goes by herself and gets dropped off there. One thing I noticed here too, another nitpick with small details, but it feels like, come on. Doris Morgan's gravestone says something like 1955 to 1990, and I think it was earlier in 90s, so she was 34, I believe, when she died, and I was trying to do the math. I was like, okay, that means she had Deb. Deb is like, what, 17 years old or something like that? Take that back, we'll say she was like 17 or 18 when she had Deb, and then she had the other kid probably, I don't know, a couple of years prior to that, so was she 15 when she had her first kid with Harry? I don't know if that was intended to be that way, but it didn't seem like the math really worked out because she had to be pretty young and having her first kid, which is possible, but I'm not sure if they realized that was the route they went with her. And then we also see her later on the show, and there's no way she's under 20 based off the woman they showed us. The woman that's in the show later on is like in her mid-30s, which is presumably when she died, which would have been way before Deb was born. So just feels like the timeline as far as ages and things like that aren't really consistent. So probably try not to pay attention to those if you're trying to keep your sanity when it comes to, hey, how old are you? What's the time here? What's the year? So not really consistent across the board there. But getting back to Deb, so she's at the cemetery and she's talking to her mom out loud and she's crying. So decent scene here. As I mentioned, if I was giving any nitpicks, it's a little bit dragged out, but She is really emotional in the scene, so it makes sense for that to take place here. Meanwhile, Dexter finally gets out of the horse situation, goes back to the station, doesn't see his dad there. He runs into Batista, really the only reference of Batista we get in the show, where he tells Dexter about the trial, how awful it went. And then we separately see that Harry wound up going to the cemetery later on. We get a quick flashback here of Harry sneaking out after being with Laura. He sees Dexter there, and Dexter drew a picture and has Harry in the family picture, so trying to set up that bond between the two of them. We also have Harry tell Laura about his first son and the traumatic experience there, so really just continuing that bond between Harry and Laura and Dexter. It feels like overall the flashbacks used in this episode specifically were better than prior episodes. Feels like the filter that you know it's a flashback is still going on, but the lighting isn't as strong and abrasive for you. It's really pretty muted, maybe because it's mostly at night in this episode, but the flashbacks I feel like had much better visuals this time around. Harry then comes home to see his wife and find out that she's pregnant with presumably Deb at this point in time. Here's where I point out there's no way she's like 17 in the scene, but I already talked about that there. We then cut to Deb and Gio, and they're just sitting there talking with one another. He does the hair over the ear thing to her, so once again seeing that, and then they presumably wind up hooking up with one another. We cut to Harry, who's now at the bar. He's just slamming drinks left and right, and the captain comes to visit him. The captain mentions the mayor had some issues with how the trial went down, and ultimately tells Harry, hey, your job is safe, but you're going to have to work low-end cases with Maria, so he's not going to be working on that high-profile kidnapping case anymore, and he's going to have to just overall chill for now until that kind of blows over, and maybe he can go back to higher-profile cases going forward. But we get the vibe, either way, from the scene that Harry is very angry still, and I feel like he really wanted Dexter to take action here, but we find out something different instead, actually. We then cut to Dexter practicing with the M99 dosages, so he's trying to figure out, hey, how much do I put in for certain things? Then we cut back to Harry, presumably super drunk at this point. He's been driving. He's outside of Levi's house with a gun, so I'm like, oh, is he trying to take out the trash himself? Feels a little bit misguided and just careless here. So he gets out of his car and he's going up to Levi, and you can see it's kind of blurry for him. And he eventually falls down, and we see Dexter behind him, and apparently Dexter stabbed Harry with the M99. I wasn't sure after that if Dexter was also going to take out Levi, just knock out both of them, but kill Levi. But he doesn't wind up doing that here. We'll probably get some development with that in a future episode. But kind of weird scene here. He has Harry tied down as if he was one of his victims. Harry's like, what is happening? He's so shocked that this is taking place. He's not really familiar with Dexter's actual kill process, so this is the first time Harry's seeing it take place. And Dexter's kind of aggressive in this conversation. He's not acting like he's the child anymore. He's like pointing his finger down at Harry and like doing the Dexter thing where he puts his fingers on their forehead and says, what were you thinking? It says, Dad, you can't stop this anymore. He really convinces Harry that he did a good job. He was tailing Harry the whole time. Harry never knew, and he used M99. He knew the exact dosage. He really studied up on doing these kills ultimately. So he's giving Harry kind of evidence, hey, I know what I'm doing. Here's an example by kidnapping you and doing things on you that I would have done on an actual victim. He also mentions to Harry to try to finish off the selling point. You didn't try to change me. You tried to train me. Harry made Dexter to go after Levi Reed. That's really what he's been built up to at this point. He winds up letting Harry out, and Harry says something like, use smelling salts. And we finally get the scene we've gotten from the trailer quite a few times saying, take him out. It was kind of expected to be this was the guy he was talking about, but finally proven to be the case. Yes, when Harry mentions take him out, he's been talking about Levi this entire time, so cool to see that finally come to fruition here. Really giving Dexter the approval of going after this guy. And we get some of the iconic Dexter near the end of the episode music take place here as well. We end the episode ultimately with Dexter's turn to finally go into the cemetery. So finally, the third Morgan has shown up. He says something like he misses his mom because she was one of the few people that actually saw good in him. I think Harry realized who he was and tried to harness that energy, but Doris, his adopted mom, really thought that Dexter was a pure-hearted person, and he liked having someone around that thought he was a good person. We then just end the episode with him saying bye mom and walking away from the cemetery. So overall, really strong episode. As I mentioned, we stuck to the main story. We didn't veer off too much. When we did, we kind of brought it back in. All the characters felt relatively strong and had no real weak points. So I mentioned in episode 4 we had a lot of highs but then a lot of lows. This one we had a lot of highs. We didn't have any of the lows. Like when we went on the side plots, we still hung around the neutral area, so definitely didn't feel like there was anything that really dragged the episode down. One interesting thing to point out, though, we still don't have a big bad declared for the season. I'm wondering, are we going to get one? And if we do, it feels like it has to be somebody we already know at this point, because a lot of times in the series, when you have a season of a big bad, you spend a few episodes kind of uncovering their backstory and what's going on with them. We haven't done much of that. If we're going to say the kidnapper's the big bad, we've just briefly seen glimpses of them doing it. We don't know much about them at this point, so it kind of feels like if we're going to do a big bad here, I'm wondering if it's going to be somebody we know already, so we'll have to see if that comes to fruition. I've also heard rumors of the show only taking place over the span of 2 weeks, so there's a lot that happens here. Dexter gets hired, he does all these kills, a lot of stuff happening in the course of a couple weeks. Let me know your guys' thoughts. Did you really enjoy this episode like I did? Did you have some gripes with it that maybe I didn't point out here? Just overall, would love to hear your feedback as far as pros and cons and your thoughts on how the characters did and maybe some of the side plots. Would appreciate any comments and feedback down below, just continuing the discussion there. I've also thought about, I've seen some brief glimpses of them promoting the new Yellow Jacket season. I'm debating doing a review series of that as well. So if you're interested in that, let me know down in the comments below as well, because that's a series I've enjoyed thus far in the first couple seasons. Appreciate you so much for watching, and I hope to talk to you again soon.